Hey there, everyone, and welcome. Are you ready for tonight's ride down into Sasquatch Valley? Me too. So grab your snackage, get your booty on up in the saddle, and let's go. Some stories stick with you long after they're told. Not because they're terrifying, but because they change how you see the world. This is one of those stories. A story of two brothers, deep in the wilderness, who stumbled upon something they weren't meant to see. A story of an encounter so eerie, so impossible, that it forced them to question everything they thought they knew. What they saw that day was no ordinary creature. It wasn't human. But it wasn't entirely animal either. And once it locked eyes with them, there was no turning back. I've spent most of my life in the wilderness. Growing up, the mountains and forests were more familiar to me than any city street. My brother and I had hunted, camped, and explored places where few ever set foot. We knew the sounds of the wild, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of an owl. But what we experienced in Montana's remote Flathead region was unlike anything we had ever encountered before. It started like any other trip. We had planned a 3-day hunt, but after it ended, we took a local's advice and ventured deeper into the wilderness. A secluded lake beneath towering peaks became our next campsite. The air was crisp, the water still. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. From the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, the shadows too deep. There was an uneasy stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, as we lay in our tents, the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling our camp. We weren't alone. And by the time we realized what was out there, it was too late to turn back. In 2017, my brother and I set out on a guided hunting trip near Whitefish, Montana. When it ended, we decided to explore deeper into the Flathead region. Following a local's tip, we made our way to the northeast side of Swan Peak, where we found Sunburst Lake, isolated, quiet, and seemingly untouched. It felt like the perfect spot. We cleared a small area near the creek and set up camp, eager to start scouting. The day passed without incident, but when we returned that evening, our camp was destroyed. Tents flattened. Gear scattered. It looked like a bull had stormed through. But there were no tracks, no claw marks, no sign of an animal attack. It was as if someone, or something, had done this deliberately. We rebuilt everything, but unease settled in. Something about the destruction didn't make sense. That night, instead of sleeping by the creek, we moved our camp to a more open area by the lake. If someone was lurking, we wanted to see them coming. The night was eerily silent. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Circling. We grabbed our flashlights, scanning the darkness. Nothing. No movement. No eyes reflecting the beam. Just emptiness. Yet, deep in our bones, we knew we weren't alone. Morning came, but the feeling of unease hadn't left. As we packed up, my brother suddenly froze. His entire body went rigid, his eyes locked on something past my shoulder. I knew that stance, he had spotted something. But this time, he wasn't reaching for his rifle. He wasn't moving at all. I turned, expecting a bear or maybe a moose. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It stood at the edge of the trees, just beyond the sun's first rays. 8 feet tall. Broad shoulders. Thick, dark hair covering its entire body. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, but something in between. Its presence was overwhelming, as if the air itself had thickened around it. It wasn't just looking at us. It was studying us. For a long, silent moment, none of us moved. My brother, the creature, and I, all frozen in an unspoken standoff. A primal fear gripped me, something ancient and instinctive, warning me that whatever this was, it was beyond us. Then, it shifted. A slow, deliberate step, its gaze still locked onto us. The movement was almost taunting, as if daring us to react. But we couldn't. We wouldn't. Another step. Then another. And suddenly, it ran. Not like an animal, not like a man. Faster than anything that size should move. In seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the dense forest. I dove for my rifle, unzipping the case in one frantic motion. But when I raised it, there was nothing left to aim at. The trees stood still, the shadows undisturbed. It had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. But we knew better. It had been there. And it had been watching us. We still had to get out of there. And the only way back was through the trees, where it had disappeared. Neither of us spoke as we packed, but we moved fast. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. We weren't being chased, but we were being watched. I could feel it, heavy and unseen, like eyes pressing into the back of my skull. We hiked without stopping, pushing harder than ever before. By nightfall, we were still deep in the wilderness. We took turns keeping watch, but sleep never came. The silence around us felt unnatural, like the forest itself was listening. For 2 more days, we moved without incident. But that tension, that presence, never faded. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of civilization that the weight finally lifted. Only then did I exhale, realizing how tightly I'd been holding my breath. We never told anyone. Who would believe us? A massive, intelligent creature, moving like a ghost through the forest? It sounded impossible. And yet, I know what we saw. I still hunt. I still camp. But the woods feel different now. Less empty. Less ours. Because somewhere out there, beyond the trees, something watches. And waits. Not all encounters are terrifying. Some stay with you for a different reason. I was 14 when I saw my first Sasquatch. Back then, I didn't know what it was, I only knew that it wasn't supposed to exist. I had run away from home, frustrated with my siblings. The forest behind our house was my refuge, a place I knew better than any road or town. That day, I walked deep into the trees, past the trails I usually followed, until I found a quiet spot beneath a white birch tree. I lay down, listening to the wind through the leaves, and soon drifted to sleep. When I woke, something was nestled against me. Small, warm, covered in soft brown fur. A child, no, something else. Its eyes, bright and curious, met mine. It wasn't afraid. Neither was I. Then she appeared. Towering, powerful, unmistakably its mother. She studied me, then her child. For a moment, we simply existed together, caught between 2 worlds. Then, gently, she lifted the little one onto her shoulders and vanished into the trees. I never saw them again. But that day, I learned something most never will. Not everything unknown is meant to be feared. Some things are simply meant to be.